The 1980s were supposed to be the funeral for American muscle. Emissions regulations had strangled horsepower. Insurance companies had declared war on anything with a big block. And the critics were lining up to write the obituaries. But here's what those critics missed. A handful of engineers, the same stubborn, brilliant, slightly unhinged people who had built the legends of the 60s and 70s, weren't ready to quit. They hid performance inside unlikely packages, smuggled racing technology past accountants and regulators, and built machines that most people drove right past without a second glance. These are the 11 forgotten muscle cars of the 1980s. The ones that never made the posters, never got the magazine covers, and never got the respect they deserved. Until now. Number 11. The 1980 Pontiac Firebird Turbo Trans Am. By 1980, Pontiac was in a corner. The big block V8 engines that had made the Trans Am a legend through the 1970s were being suffocated by emissions requirements. Horsepower numbers had been falling off a cliff for years, and somewhere in a boardroom, somebody had decided that the answer to all of this was a turbocharged V8, that somebody was either a genius or completely out of their mind, possibly both. The 1980 Firebird Turbo Trans Am carried a 301 cubic inch V8 with a single Garrett turbocharger bolted to it. Now, 301 cubic inches sounds underwhelming, and honestly, on paper, it kinda was. Pontiac rated the thing at 210 horsepower, which was not exactly setting the world on fire. But here's where it gets interesting. That turbocharger produced torque figures that felt completely out of proportion to the displacement. 345 pound-feet of torque at relatively low revs meant this car launched off the line with a shove that caught people completely off guard. The problem was reliability. Turbocharging technology in 1980 was not what it is today. The Garrett unit had a habit of cooking itself if the engine ran hot, and the cooling system on these cars was barely adequate for the task. Owners learned very quickly that you did not just shut the engine off after a hard run, you let it idle. You gave the turbo time to cool down. You treated it with a level of respect that most muscle car buyers frankly had no interest in giving. Only about 9,356 Turbo Trans Ams were built across the 1980 and 1981 model, years before Pontiac quietly pulled the plug on the whole experiment. The car never got the chance to be fully developed. The technology was advancing fast, and Pontiac was running out of time and budget. But those who owned one understood they were driving something genuinely experimental, a machine built at the exact moment when American performance was reinventing itself and hadn't quite figured out how yet. That makes the Turbo Trans Am not a failure. It makes it a fascinating footnote in the story of how muscle survived. Number 10. The 1983 Ford Mustang GT Convertible. Everyone remembers the Fox-body Mustang GT Coupe. It showed up on bedroom walls and in every car magazine that mattered during the 1980s. But ask most people about the 1983 GT Convertible, and you'll get a blank stare. Which is a shame, because this car deserves a lot better than being forgotten. Ford brought the Mustang convertible back in 1983 for the first time since 1973, and they paired it with the 5.0-liter V8 that was beginning its legendary comeback arc. The engine produced 175 horsepower at launch, which by today's standards sounds like a riding lawnmower. But here's the context that matters. In 1983, that number represented genuine progress. The V8 Mustang had been climbing back from its dark period, and the GT convertible represented proof that Ford was serious about performance again. What made this car truly special wasn't just the engine. It was the combination of open-air motoring and actual rear-wheel drive muscle car behavior. Drop the top, plant your right foot, and the rear end of the 1983 GT would step out in a way that reminded you exactly what American performance cars were supposed to feel like. The handling was raw, the brakes required planning, the ride was stiff enough to rattle your fillings on a bad road. In other words, it was perfect. Ford built relatively few of these compared to the coupe, and even fewer have survived in original condition. Convertibles get driven hard, they get left in the rain, they get modified beyond recognition. Finding a clean, numbers-matching 1983 GT convertible today is genuinely difficult, which is exactly why collectors who do find them tend to hold on very tightly. This was the car that proved the Mustang's comeback was real. It just never got credit for it. Number 9. The 1984 Buick Regal T-Type. Before the Grand National became a legend, before the GNX became worth more than a small house, there was the T-Type. And almost nobody paid attention to it. That was, as it turns out, a significant mistake. The 1984 Buick Regal T-Type was the direct ancestor of the Grand National, carrying the same turbocharged 3.8-liter V6 that would eventually embarrass Corvettes and Ferraris by the middle of the decade. In 1984, the T-Type produced around 200 horsepower and 265 pound-feet of torque. Not earth-shattering numbers on their own. But the T-Type weighed in at around 3,500 pounds. And that turbo V6 had a way of delivering its power in a manner that felt genuinely aggressive. When the boost built up and the turbo came on song, this car surged forward with an urgency that caught people completely off guard. The styling was understated in that particular way that Buick had mastered. Dark paint, blacked out trim, no screaming hood scoops, or outrageous graphics. The T-Type looked like something a very serious, very quiet person drove to work and back, which made it absolutely perfect for hunting Camaros at stoplights. And yes, it hunted Camaros at stoplights. Buick sold the T-Type without ever really advertising it aggressively, which meant it existed in this strange space between being a performance car and being a secret. The people who knew about it knew. Everyone else just saw a Buick Regal and kept driving. Today, the T-Type sits in the shadow of its more famous Grand National sibling, which is understandable but slightly unfair. The T-Type was where Buick proved the concept worked. The Grand National was just where they turned the volume all the way up. Number 8. The 1980 Oldsmobile 442 W30. Here's a number that should make your jaw drop. In 1980, Oldsmobile built exactly 886 examples of the 442 W30. 886. That's not a production run. That's practically a hand-built limited edition. And yet most muscle car fans couldn't tell you this car existed if their life depended on it. The 442 badge had meant serious things in the 1960s. 4-barrel carburetor, 4-speed transmission, dual exhausts. By 1980, the formula had evolved, but Oldsmobile was still determined to put some teeth into the name. The W30 package delivered a 348 cubic inch Oldsmobile V8, an engine not available anywhere else in the lineup. You couldn't get this motor in a standard Cutlass. You couldn't option it onto anything else. If you wanted this specific engine, this was the only car it came in. The W30 also came with a rally suspension package that actually improved handling meaningfully over the standard Cutlass setup. The ride was firm, the cornering was composed, and the power delivery from that exclusive V8 gave the car a character entirely its own. Oldsmobile finished every example in either black with gold accents or white with gold accents, which gave the W30 a visual identity that was bold without being ridiculous. It looked purposeful. It looked like a car that had something to prove. And here's the tragic part of this story. 1980 was the last year for the rear-wheel drive Cutlass in this configuration. After this, the platform changed, the engine disappeared, and the 442 name got applied to cars that were shadows of what this one represented. 886 examples of the last true W30. That's not a forgotten car. That's a ghost. A fast, gold-striped, genuinely rare ghost. Number 7. The 1983 Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS. Let's talk about a car that looked like a NASCAR racer, drove on the same streets as your dentist's Oldsmobile, and somehow convinced several thousand people a year to hand over their money for something that made 180 horsepower. That car is the 1983 Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS. And before you roll your eyes, hear the argument out. Chevrolet revived the SS badge for the Monte Carlo in 1983 for one specific reason: NASCAR homologation. The racing rules required manufacturers to produce a minimum number of street-legal versions of any body style they wanted to run on the oval tracks. Chevrolet needed to sell enough Monte Carlo SS coupes to qualify, so they built them, painted them in two-tone configurations with ground effects and a rear spoiler, and sent them to dealerships where they sat alongside family sedans and station wagons. The contrast was absolutely magnificent. The 5-liter V8 producing 180 horsepower was not the point. The The point was that underneath the ordinary performance numbers was a body designed in a wind tunnel. The aerodynamic package that made the Monte Carlo SS competitive at Daytona and Talladega was the same body that regular buyers were getting at their local Chevrolet dealership. You were, in a very real sense, buying a NASCAR race car in street clothing. The fact that it happened to make modest power was almost beside the point. On the track, Monte Carlo SS race cars dominated superspeedway, racing through the mid-1980s. Darrell Waltrip drove them to championships. The cars were genuinely fast where it counted, at sustained high speeds where aerodynamics mattered more than horsepower ratings. The street version carried that DNA. And for collectors today, finding a clean early Monte Carlo SS with the original drivetrain is harder than it looks. These cars got driven, modified, and crashed with enthusiasm. The survivors are worth considerably more than anyone paid for them in 1983. Number 6. The 1981 AMC Eagle SX4. Alright, I know what you're thinking, AMC in a muscle car video? Stay with me here, because this one is genuinely fascinating and also slightly insane, which are two qualities that go very well together. American Motors Corporation introduced the Eagle in 1980 as the first mass-produced passenger car with standard four-wheel drive, which was, in retrospect, a genuinely revolutionary idea that arrived about 15 years before the rest of the automotive industry figured out that customers actually wanted it. The SX4 was the sport coupe version of this concept, and when you equipped it with the 2.5-liter four-cylinder or the optional 2.8-liter V6, and engaged that standard four-wheel drive system, you had something that no other muscle car of the era could offer: traction. Actual, genuine, usable traction in any weather condition. Now, the SX4 was never going to win a drag race against a Camaro. Nobody is claiming that. The horsepower figures were modest, the 0 to 60 times were unspectacular, and the styling was the particular kind of boxy that only the early 1980s could produce. But here's what the SX4 could do that nothing else could. It could put its power down on any surface, in any season, without drama. Snow, rain, gravel, mud. The Eagle SX4 simply went where you pointed it. The tragedy of AMC is that they were building ideas that were ahead of their time with a budget that was behind their ambitions. The company collapsed in 1987, and the Eagle concept got absorbed into Chrysler, where it eventually evolved into what we now recognize as the modern AWD performance sedan template. The SX4 never got credit for being first. It just got forgotten. And that, frankly, is one of the great injustices of automotive history. Somebody get this car a publicist. Number 5. The 1986 Ford Mustang SVO. If you want to understand why the 1986 Ford Mustang SVO made V8 loyalists genuinely uncomfortable, here is all you need to know. This car made 205 horsepower from a turbocharged 2.3-liter four-cylinder engine. The 5-liter V8 GT that sat right next to it on the showroom floor made 210 horsepower. The SVO cost significantly more, and it was, by almost every objective measure, the better driver's car. Ford's Special Vehicle Operations team built the SVO with a philosophy that was almost European in its focus. Handling, balance, braking, and driver engagement were prioritized over straight-line acceleration. The SVO got adjustable Coney shock absorbers, a Hurst shifter, four-wheel disc brakes when most Mustangs were still running rear drums, and a hood that vented heat away from the engine in a way that looked genuinely aggressive. The 15-inch wheels wore wider performance tires than any other Mustang of the era. The whole package felt precise and intentional in a way that the pushrod V8 GT, for all its charm, simply didn't. The SVO could pull lateral grip numbers that embarrassed its stablemates. It changed direction quickly, communicated what the front tires were doing with unusual clarity for an American car of the period, and stopped with authority that made the driver feel genuinely confident. The Turbo 4 had some lag at low revs, but when the boost arrived, the power delivery was linear and satisfying. This was a sports car wearing Mustang clothing, a genuinely sophisticated machine that happened to have a pony badge on the grille. Ford discontinued the SVO after the 1986 model year because buyers kept choosing the cheaper, simpler, louder V8 GT instead. The market had spoken, and the market was not interested in sophisticated. The market wanted rumble, but the engineers who built the SVO were not wrong. They were just early. Everything they put into that car, the focus on chassis dynamics, the turbocharged efficiency, the driver feedback, became the template for performance cars a decade later. The SVO was the Mustang that arrived 20 years ahead of schedule. Number 4. The 1980 Chrysler Cordoba 300. This one requires a little bit of historical setup, so bear with the story because it pays off. The Chrysler 300 was one of the most revered nameplates in American automotive history. From 1955 through the mid-1960s, the letter series 300s were genuine performance machines. Powerful, elegant, and devastatingly fast for their era. The badge carried real weight, real meaning. Then the 1970s happened, and the 300 name got applied to cars that had no business wearing it. By 1979, it was gone entirely, a casualty of the malaise era. Then, in 1980, Chrysler brought it back, sort of. The Cordoba 300 was a special edition package built on the existing Cordoba platform, and it came with a 360 cubic inch V8 that produced 185 horsepower, which, to be fair, was not terrible for 1980. The package also included a unique hood treatment, specific badging, upgraded suspension tuning, and a level of visual presence that the standard Cordoba completely lacked. This car wanted you to know it was different. It wanted you to know that name still meant something. Production was extremely limited, which is one of the reasons almost nobody knows this car exists today. Chrysler was in genuine financial crisis in 1980. The company was surviving on government loan guarantees, and the promise that Lee Iacocca could somehow hold everything together. Building limited edition performance packages was not exactly the priority. The fact that the Cordoba 300 existed at all feels like an act of defiance. A small group of people inside a struggling company saying that they weren't going to let the 300 name go out quietly. They were right to fight for it. The car just never got the audience it deserved. Number 3. The 1987 Pontiac Grand Prix 2+2. The story of the 1987 Pontiac Grand Prix 2+2 is one of the great what-if stories of the 1980s. What if a manufacturer built a NASCAR homologation special that looked genuinely exotic, packed with aerodynamic purpose, and then priced it so far above the competition that almost nobody bought one? The answer to that question is exactly 1,225 units and a permanent place on the Forgotten Cars list. Pontiac designed the 2+2 specifically to qualify for NASCAR superspeedway racing, following the same homologation logic that Chevrolet had used with the Monte Carlo SS. The car featured a sweeping fastback roofline with a massive wraparound rear window that improved aerodynamics at sustained high speeds. The visual effect was dramatic. This car did not look like anything else on American roads in 1987. It looked purposeful and aggressive in a way that most American cars of that era completely failed to achieve. Under the hood sat a 305 cubic inch LG4 V8, producing 180 horsepower, which by this point, you've probably noticed, was the standard answer Pontiac and Chevrolet gave to every performance question in the 1980s. The engine was not the story. The body was the story. That aerodynamic package was genuine, functional, and genuinely beautiful in a decade that wasn't producing much automotive beauty. The problem was the price. The 2+2 cost approximately $2,000 more than a Monte Carlo SS Aero Coupe, which was already a hard sell. Pontiac dealers couldn't move them. Many of the cars ended up being sold at factory auctions rather than retail. The small trunk opening created by that dramatic fastback design frustrated buyers who expected practical storage. The rear seat got uncomfortably hot because the greenhouse effect through that huge rear window was substantial. It was a car full of compromises that the market refused to make. But here's what makes the 2+2 genuinely interesting today. Those 1,225 units represent one of the rarest NASCAR homologation specials ever produced. The car that nobody wanted in 1987 is now exactly the kind of piece that serious collectors hunt for, specifically because of its obscurity. The 2+2 failed commercially and succeeded historically. That's a uniquely American kind of story. Number 2, the 1983 Hearst Oldsmobile. There are certain combinations in automotive history that just work. Peanut butter and chocolate, racing stripes and a hood scoop, Hearst and Oldsmobile. The partnership between Hearst Performance and Oldsmobile had produced some of the most memorable muscle cars of the 1960s and early 70s. Then the partnership went quiet for a decade. And then, in 1983, it came back. And it came back wearing one of the most visually arresting paint schemes ever applied to an American performance car. The 1983 Hearst Oldsmobile was built on the Cutlass Supreme platform and came in a black body with silvered lower body panels separated by red striping. In 1984, Oldsmobile inverted the scheme to silver over black, keeping the red accents. Either way, the visual effect was striking. This was a car that demanded attention before you even registered that it was an Oldsmobile. And then you'd notice the Hearst lightning rod shifter, which was arguably the most entertaining piece of equipment ever installed in a production American automobile. The lightning rod shifter was a triple lever setup sitting in the center console. 3 individual chrome shifters arranged side by side, each controlling a different gear in the automatic transmission. First gear, second gear, and drive, all operated separately with a flick of the wrist. It sounds completely impractical, and in some ways it was, but it created a driving experience that felt genuinely theatrical, like operating some kind of very fast, very American spaceship. You didn't just drive the Hearst Olds, you performed it. The 307 cubic inch V8 produced 180 horsepower, which was the era's standard answer, but the rally suspension, the T-top roof, the upgraded chassis tuning, and the sheer drama of that interior made the Hearst Olds feel like considerably more than the sum of its parts. Oldsmobile built 3,000 units in 1983 and 3,500 in 1984. Not rare enough to be a unicorn, but exclusive enough to matter. The Hearst Olds was the last collaboration between these two legendary names. It went out with style, with red pinstripes, and with the most entertaining shifter in the history of the automatic transmission. Number 1, the 1989 Chevrolet Camaro IROC Z1LE. Here's the thing about the 1LE package. Chevrolet didn't advertise it. It didn't appear prominently in brochures. Dealerships weren't trained to explain it. You couldn't walk into a showroom and ask for one by name and expect the salesperson to know what you were talking about. The 1LE was a factory racing preparation package that Chevrolet offered specifically to allow the IROC Z to compete in the SCCA showroom stock racing series. And it was, without question, one of the most capable factory performance packages that any American manufacturer built during the entire 1980s. Nobody knew it existed. The 1LE package started with the standard IROC CZ, and then stripped away everything that added weight without adding performance. The air conditioning was deleted, the heavy battery was relocated to the trunk to improve weight distribution. The brake cooling ducts were upgraded to race specification. The suspension received specific spring rates, and shock valving tuned for road course use rather than straight-line drag strip performance. The result was a Camaro that weighed significantly less than the standard IROC Z and handled with a precision that the platform had never demonstrated before. The 5.7-liter V8 produced 240 horsepower, the same as the standard IROC Z. But in the lighter, better balanced 1LE chassis, those horses did more work. The car could carry genuinely impressive speeds through corners. The brakes could handle repeated hard stops without the fade that plagued the standard IROC. The steering communicated what the front tires were doing with unusual clarity. This was not a drag strip weapon. This was a road course car built by Chevrolet engineers who understood the difference and cared about it deeply. The catch was how you got one. Because the 1LE was a racing homologation package rather than a conventional option, it was only available when specific boxes were checked and others were specifically left unchecked on the order form. Not checking the air conditioning box was the primary trigger. Most buyers ordering a performance Camaro in 1989 checked every available option box, because that's what buyers did. The 1LE effectively ordered itself by accident in most cases. which meant the people who ended up with them often didn't realize what they had until they took the car to a track and discovered it was doing things that standard IROC Zs couldn't approach. Chevrolet built around 2,000 1LE equipped Camaros in 1989. Today, documented examples command serious premiums because the combination of rarity, racing heritage, and genuine performance capability puts the 1LE in a category entirely its own. This was not a car built for the showroom. It was a car built for the track, sold through the showroom accidentally, and discovered by the lucky few who stumbled into owning one. The 1989 Camaro IROC Z 1LE is proof that the best muscle cars of the 1980s weren't on the posters. They were hiding in the order books, waiting for the right person to accidentally check the right boxes. The 1980s didn't kill American muscle, it forced it underground. Into homologation specials, factory racing packages, turbocharged experiments, and sleeper sedans wearing Buick badges. The engineers who kept performance alive during that decade didn't get the credit the 60s legends received. They worked within tighter budgets, tighter regulations, and a market that had largely stopped caring about horsepower. But they kept building anyway, and what they built, these 11 forgotten machines included, laid the foundation for every performance car that came screaming back in the 1990s and beyond. These weren't failures, they were the bridge.